start recording now.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everybody, again, and thank you for signing in and coming to our series. Just to remind you, we introduced this series to allow junior investigators hear about the pathway that more senior people took to accomplish independence and success in HIV research. And we started in our previous talks with really senior accomplished investigators. And we decided that probably it's a good idea to have somebody younger and more junior to present their view on the pathway to independence, as they may be closer to real kind of beginning investigators in terms of career. And today we invited John Rendina to present his view and his history of getting independence. And just as a brief introduction, John received his PhD in 2014 in basic and applied social psychology. So formally, he's still within this 10-year period after graduation, after a final degree, which qualifies him as an early career investigator by NIH standards. So he can still apply for this kind of type of grants. But despite this early stage of his career, John already accomplished certain things in the career. He's associate research professor now at the Department of Epidemiology in our GW School of Public Health, and he also is a senior director of research at Whitman Walker Institute. I think John will say more about himself in his talk, and I will give him the opportunity to do that. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, are you seeing the PowerPoint presentation full screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. I have to admit this was an unusual talk to put together. I think it's probably a little bit easier for people who are farther along in their careers, but I have just recently given my job talk at GW, so I decided to take a very different approach to this, since several of you probably already saw that. I chose to title this My Path to Interdependence, to highlight the ways in which much of the success in my career has been the result of really strong partnerships and really strong mentorship. And so to the extent that I am independent, it is really independent in forming partnerships. So I'll try to highlight that throughout the talk. And I thought it would just also be helpful to really highlight throughout the talk the ways in which where I've landed has been the result of a series of pleasant coincidences. So I'll try to hit on several of the moments in my career that led to a big shift or aha moment that really weren't things that I could have planned for myself. I think a lot of more junior people see job talks and they see a very linear and well-planned career trajectory. And I think it's easy for them to be displayed in that way, but I'm going to try to show the ways in which these things were not as linear or straightforward as they might appear. So thought I would start by introducing myself as a child. So I was born November 24th, 1985. I was not interested in joining the world yet. I was a week late, so I would have been born a Scorpio, but instead was born a Sagittarius. I was 9 pounds and my mom was in labor for 17 hours. So I made it quite a process to join the planet. And I am the parent or the child of a father who is Italian American and a mother who is Irish American. So I have a very large and well-connected family. Um, my mom was 25 when she had me, and my dad was 33. So they had quite a difference in their ages. And in fact, my mom lied about my dad's age to her family for the first 2 years that they were dating because she met him when she was 18 and he was her manager at work when they first met each other. And I am the older of 2 children. So you can see my brother there in the left, and that is my dad. And then, of course, that is my mom. And being Irish and Italian, I was raised Catholic. And something that a lot of people don't know about me is that I actually went to Catholic school for 13 years. So this at the top is the grade school that I attended, and at the bottom is the high school that I attended. Both of them are actually the same schools that my father and all of his siblings attended. So this was also very much rooted in our Italian American background. Both of these are in Little Italy in Wilmington, Delaware, which is the area in which I grew up. And as someone who was raised Catholic, I received, Holy Communion, which is the picture that is on the right, and was confirmed in 8th grade, and then went on to Catholic high school. And my high school was actually all boys, which was particularly interesting. Growing up gay, to be in an all boys high school was a very sports oriented environment. And so high school was a very interesting time for me, and I think was very formative in terms of the career that I ultimately landed in. For a Catholic high school, it was actually relatively progressive. The religious order that ran it is the second most liberal order after the Jesuits. So they're called the Oblates. And so I was exposed to things like HIV education in high school, which led the foundation for my later interest in HIV. Surprisingly enough, we did have much more comprehensive sex education than a lot of the schools in the country that aren't even religious in nature, which was great. It was also the time of the internet, and I was preparing to come out in early high school. And so I did a lot of self-education around sexual orientation and sexual identity so that I could be prepared to address questions that my parents might have. And so I think that was very foundational for my interest in sexual identity and sexual orientation as a research topic, as well as my interest in educating around those topics as well. I did come out to my parents in high school at the age of 16. And then I did it in reverse. So most sexual identity development theories say that you start with your friends and you end with your family. But I started with my parents. So a little bit of the opposite direction. But I did come out to a lot of folks in my high school, which was an all boys high school, and that was a very interesting experience. But I didn't really love high school. I wasn't the best student in high school. I didn't find the topics very interesting until my senior year when I took AP psychology, which is when I started to envision a future career for myself that I had not previously been able to envision. So I went on to college at Penn State at University Park. And this, I would say, was the first of the random events in my life. I actually chose Penn State because my older cousin, who I was very close with, was there at Penn State, and I thought it would be fun to go to the same college as her. I actually almost did not even get in to Penn State main campus because my high school grades were not that great because I didn't like high school very much. But they had received the wrong SAT scores for me. And so they initially rejected me, and then they received the correct SAT scores and they ultimately accepted me. However, that was contingent upon me starting in the summer semester before the fall that I was supposed to begin, which actually turned out to be great because I took Intro to Sociology during that summer semester, and it was a smaller class than most Penn State classes would be, especially for, you know, a 100 level social science course. And that was great because that really set me on the path, in addition to AP psychology in high school, to really being interested in the social sciences and wanting to pursue those as my field of study and as a career. So in college, I actually made my own major. I was not satisfied with being strictly within one of the social science disciplines. So I followed a pathway that Penn State had for creating your own major, in which you would select courses from a multidisciplinary set of options. And so I developed a focus on sexuality, gender, and health, and was able to design my curriculum to take courses across multiple different departments, including psychology, sociology, women's studies, biobehavioral health, which was our equivalent of public health at Penn State, and human development and family studies. And so that is where I was first exposed to some of the formative concepts and theories that led to my work. So through, in particular, the women's studies courses that I took, I was exposed to feminist and queer theories, and though I didn't know them by this name at the time, that was the first time that I was exposed to concepts of intersectionality. And queer theory in particular was a very interesting course that I took in my junior year. Up until then, I had seen sexual identity from a very social science standpoint, but queer theory really calls into question a lot of the assumptions that we make in social science, which started my interest in, you know, more critical theories that can be applied within social sciences. I was exposed to theories of health behaviors, of course. I was particularly interested in attachment theory and the notion of internal working models that attachment theory proposes, and how that related to social stigma and minority stress. So this was when I first started being exposed to these concepts, which ultimately led to my interest in rejection sensitivity, which became something that I focused on more in graduate school. Most importantly, during my the second semester of my freshman year, I took my first course that was specifically focused on sexual orientation. This is Dr. Tony Diagelli. He became my undergraduate mentor after I took this class that he and Dr. Katarina Sinclair, who is also pictured here, she was his doctoral student and TA for that course. And I liked the course so much and the research that we were exposed to in this course that I joined his lab, and ultimately he became not just my mentor, but also the advisor for my undergraduate thesis work. So he had an R01 that was conducted in New York City called the Q&A Project, and it was focused on LGBTQ youth and mental health, and in particular, suicidality, to understand the risk factors for suicidality and ways to prevent suicidality among LGBTQ youth. So this is one of the books that he edited that we used in class. And it was really wonderful working with him. He was very supportive of me, and Kat was a very strong methodologist, and Tony had a very particular way that he wanted things to be done, and Kat was very supportive in helping me to navigate those within my honors thesis so that I was able to finish it successfully. And I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on sexual risk behaviors among the sexual minority boys in the sample that they had, and looked at some of the parental and social factors that were associated with engagement in sexual behavior as a teenager, and then factors associated with sexual risk behavior as well. So that was a really great experience. Also at this time, I believed that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. I had in my mind that the best way to help people was to do that directly in a clinical setting. And luckily, the two of them were able to convince me that research would be a much better way for me personally to help people, that I was not going to be the most ideal clinical psychologist in the world, and that I probably would not enjoy it all that much. I hadn't really had any opportunities for direct one-on-one client engagement, and they turned out to be exactly right. Research is 100% the path that I belonged on. And so actually, as a result of them, I ultimately did not apply to any clinical psychology programs. And I had my heart set on moving to New York City after being stuck in central Pennsylvania for 4 years. And so I applied actually only to grad schools in New York City. And so Tony was very instrumental in actually shaping the career that I ultimately was able to take on, even just by insisting that I not go into clinical psychology and that I go into a research-focused program. So I ultimately went into a social psychology program in New York City at the CUNY Graduate Center. One particular challenge that I faced during this time is actually that the graduate program that I joined was split between folks that had very strict qualitative research methods and believed that that was the only way to do research, and then more mainstream social psychologists who had joined the department more recently. And so it was great because I was actually exposed to both viewpoints, which I think, again, helped to shape my ability to take on different perspectives and to be critical of my own assumptions and research methods. And so my program actually split into two different programs while I was in my third year of graduate school. And I had to choose which of the two programs I was going to go into. So I actually started graduate school in one program and finished graduate school in a different psychology program. And this was my graduate mentor, Dr. Sarit Golub. She is a social psychologist, and she is still at CUNY at Hunter College, which is actually where I then went on to have my first job after graduate school. And I was in the same department as her, which was wonderful. And she was incredibly influential on my work. And one thing that I wanted to add to this slide that she actually gave me as a gift at one point was a little printout that said, sometimes the questions are complicated and the answers are simple, which I sometimes try to remind myself of because I think it's an important mantra. I tend to ask very complicated research questions, especially back then. I tended to see things in a very complex way. And I think that this is a nice quote to illustrate that sometimes the answers are not as complicated as the questions. So at the end of my second year of graduate school, I decided that I wanted to take on research full-time. I still had 2 more years of classes left, but I decided I wanted to have a full-time research position. So I was able to take on a research coordinator role for a study that was starting called Pillow Talk. Pillow Talk was a new study focused on highly sexually active sexual minority men. And in particular, was focused on sexual compulsivity, which was not really a particular interest of mine, but that was what the study was framed around. But one of the most exciting aspects of the study was that it had a daily diary component to it. And I had not been exposed to daily diary research before. And so I was tasked with figuring out the daily diary component of the study, which turned out to be a huge influence on my career, as it is a method that I now use in almost every study that I do. But at the time, I came across it simply because I was assigned to learn it for the study that I was helping to implement. So at that time, I was able to learn a lot about daily diary methodology. I took an intensive training with in-person designs with some experts in that area over the summer after taking on this position. And that really got me into thinking about the difference between person processes and within person processes, and the benefits of being able to capture both of those simultaneously, which then necessitated that I learn a bunch of advanced statistics, which turned out to also be a huge influence in my career because I later became the biostatistician for a lot of studies, which gave me great exposure to a range of different research methods, but also gave me opportunity to publish with a lot of different people, as I was the one that did the analyses for a lot of the papers across a lot of our different studies. And so given the complexities that I am interested in, I started thinking a lot about psychological dualities in graduate school. Echoing back to my interest in attachment, one of those dualities would be anxiety and avoidance. So the two main domains within attachment. Rejection sensitivity is a measure that takes into account both worry about rejection and likelihood of rejection. So that was another duality I was thinking about a lot. With Sarit, I was working on some papers around HIV diagnosis and the ways that it impacts identity, and the concepts that we worked on were the ideas that it led to both identity growth and identity loss. So people talked about losing a piece of themselves as a result of their HIV diagnosis, but that ultimately it helped them to grow as a person. We talked to a lot of people in one of the studies who actually said that the HIV positive diagnosis that they received changed their life in a positive way, and that they wouldn't go back and take away that diagnosis, even if they were given the option, because it ultimately had such a positive impact on their life, even though it did lead to an initial sense of loss. And then I got very interested in the ways that sexual risk behavior was this tension between risk aversion, but also pleasure seeking or reward seeking. And the other main duality that I became really interested in was the duality between stigma and stigma resistance or resilience. So I ultimately learned a lot about dual process models in graduate school. My master's thesis ended up being a qualitative study, which was a very interesting process for me. People who know me do not know me as a qualitative researcher. I am very quantitative. I think of things best in very structured models, and qualitative research proved to be quite a challenge for me, but it was a great experience, and I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to do it. So I did a master's thesis called Concealing and Revealing that was focused on HIV-related identity and the way that HIV integrated into people's possible selves or self-discrepancies. And then ultimately, I actually ended up doing my dissertation on the Pillow Talk study. So with the Pillow Talk study that I became the research coordinator for, I ultimately ended up writing an F31 that I was able to latch on to that study, and I collected some secondary data on top of the study on top of the existing data that were being collected as part of that study. And then I used the measures that I added along with the daily diary to do a within and between person design to look at dual process sexual decision making. So that study that I ended up being placed onto for my first research job ended up not only teaching me daily diary methodology that I've now used in the rest of my career, but also ended up being the impetus for my very first research grant, my F31, and ultimately my dissertation. So when I finished my PhD, I actually decided to stay at CUNY, and I applied for the loan repayment program. So I don't know how many doctoral students are actually on right now. I'm not recognizing any from the participant list. But an important thing that a lot of people don't know is that you can actually apply for the NIH loan repayment program in your final year of graduate school and then have it lined up for you when you finish graduate school. They don't get awarded until August. And so if you apply in your final year of graduate school, it is possible to actually get it within a few months of finishing, so that you don't actually have to start loan repayment yourself when you leave deferment or forbearance. It actually can pick right up and start covering those loans. So that's just something I like to highlight for people, since it's not all that well known that you can submit the application while you're still in graduate school. I went on to write a K award 3 months after defending my dissertation, which was a great experience because it led to me being able to do my first pilot study that I developed myself, and that study was called Day to Day. And for those who know my work, I actually still have a study that's called Day to Day that is just wrapping up now. So this was a study to look at daily fluctuations in HIV-related stigma. So I wanted to develop an event-level HIV stigma scale and look at the ways that experiences of stigma changed across different days, which ultimately led the foundation for a lot of the work that I'm doing now. I also, during this time, thanks to the K Award, was able to serve as the research scientist and biostatistician on a couple of other awards, and one of the ones that I'll highlight here was called 1,000 Strong. This was a nationwide cohort study of sexual minority men looking at HIV risk as an outcome, which might sound familiar since that is a type of study that I still have today. And then finally, I was able to participate in the Fordham HIV and Substance Use Research Ethics Training Institute, or the READY, which I highlight because it's a really great program that provides early career people with pilot money to do a study that is focused on research ethics issues within HIV and substance use research. And that turned out to be a really great experience. I actually had the opportunity to do my first ever survey, nationwide survey using a Grindr ad, and that led to the foundation of the way that I do advertising for all of my studies now. So I'll just highlight a couple of papers that I was able to do during this time that really show the development of my interests, which were in incorporating the influence of HIV stigma and sexual minority stigma. So I still hadn't quite made my way to intersectionality and the ways in which these stigmas can coexist within the same person. So I was using multiple measures, a sexual identity stigma measure and an HIV stigma measure. And we were doing this actually both at the individual level and at the within person level. And so these papers actually then set the foundation for my first NIH research grants, R-series grants. So the first one was the continuation of the day-to-day study. So this study was focused on within-person variability in HIV stigma and how that was associated with psychological stress reactivity, and whether those disruptions in stress reactivity through cortisol influence inflammatory profiles that might underlie HIV disease progression. So really looking for a biological mechanism through which stigma influences HIV progression. There's been a lot of literature on the behavioral ways that stigma manifests, but not a lot tying it to biopsychosocial processes. So that study is actually just wrapping up now. I received that study in 2017, and I wrote that grant 4 different times. So that is my lesson in perseverance to folks that have not had luck with convincing review panels on the first round or 2. I say don't give up. I would recommend switching the grant to a different review panel using the reviewer request form that NIH provides you, and seeing if you can get different luck with a different audience. This was the first of 2 grants that took me 4 submissions to ultimately get, and so I definitely recommend perseverance. But at the same time, I recommend RFAs. I have had a lot more success with RFAs than with general grant submissions. So day-to-day really built off of my interest in day level processes. Unite built off of the work that I had done as part of the 1,000 Strong cohort and as part of the Fordham study that I ran. And that was our first, that was the first light grant. And that was focused on a national cohort of sexual minority men looking at integrating stigma, minority stress, and syndemics theory into a unified model, and using HIV outcomes to validate the model rather than relying on risk behaviors. So during graduate school, my entire dissertation focused on risk behaviors, and I tried about 6 different ways of defining risk behavior and got very tired of looking at risk behaviors. And so this was an opportunity to validate a psychosocial model on the actual HIV outcomes. And so the UNITE study just ended about a year ago and was the precursor to our current UPLIFT study. And this slide also shows at the top all of my graduate students that I worked with at Hunter. And then the bottom is a bunch of the staff that worked on all of these projects. And so all of these things then came together when NIH put out the PRISM RFA, which was the Intersectional Stigma Measurement RFA for R21s. And I actually was busy with my 2 larger grants that I had just gotten the year before, and I wasn't going to submit to PRISM. And then one day, about 5 days before the deadline, I had an aha moment about the ways in which the event level data that we were collecting were not working well because they weren't optimized for event level collection. We had taken individual level items and put them into a daily diary context without optimizing those items for the event level context. And so I suddenly realized that for my future studies, I really needed measures that were well designed for daily use. And so I decided at the last minute to write this R21 to do that. And it set the stage for not only my thinking about intersectional stigma, but also a lot of the changes in my career that we're about to follow. So we started the study with a qualitative component where we asked people to help us think about how to define the daily experience of intersectional stigma, and really learned about how to center measurement within the lived experience of folks, shifting from measurement of individual experiences to the context. So our participants talked a lot about the ways in which spaces and places were the manifestation of intersectional stigma, that the difference between people who experienced multiple marginalized identities and people who might have only had one marginalized identity is that there are no safe spaces, that no matter where they go, at least one of their marginalized statuses is being marginalized. And they talked a lot about the experience of stigma being enough as the outcome, like that stigma should be the thing that is being studied as the problem, not as the mechanism to another problem. So this was all really helpful. We then did cognitive interviews to optimize those for daily use, and then a pilot study. And then came the summer of 2020. So during that time, NIH, as a result of the PRISM RFA, had pulled together an intersectional stigma working group. And you'll see on this slide, probably not easy to see the individual names, but just showing the incredible breadth of the people that NIH pulled together into these intersectional stigma working groups that I was very privileged to be a part of as a result of our PRISM grant that we received. And I was placed on work group 1, which was focused on harmonizing methods and measurements of intersectional stigma and discrimination. And I was on that work group with a lot of amazing people, including several people from the DC CFAR, such as Tamara Taggart and Lisa Bolag and Deanna Kerrigan. And at that very same time, I was asked to be on the dissertation committee of someone who was finishing her PhD in epidemiology at GW. And so I attended the defense as an outside reader would. And it was such a nice experience. And I met such wonderful people that I decided to look and see if GW had any open jobs. And what I found was the position that I am now in, which is an associate research professor and the senior director of research at Whitman Walker, which I actually never would have found if I hadn't been on that dissertation committee. And it was difficult thinking about switching careers. And it was actually the intersectional stigma working group that ultimately made me realize that a lot of the people that I should be working with were actually at GW. And so these two things happening at the exact same time in the summer of 2020 led me to my new career. PRISM had really made me want to do work that was more embedded within community and more directly aligned with community, which became very difficult to do at the university that I was in. And so this position was like, it felt like fate for me that there was an open position that was both an academic research position and embedded within a community organization that was seeking to grow. And so without PRISM and without some of the studies that led me to doing PRISM, I would not be where I am today. Which ultimately led then to two additional coincidences. So in the summer of 2021, NIH released two new grant opportunities. Now we knew that Light 2 was coming out, but it wasn't until the PRISM Intersectional Working Group that I realized that the main thing that we really needed from that study was to center the HIV inequities in the structures that were creating them. And so I had decided as a result of that PRISM working group to focus the next iteration of the study on structural stigma. And as a result of joining Whitman Walker and having access to a policy team, decided that one of the ways to do that was through looking at policy, state level policy, which I never would have had the capacity to do if I was not at Whitman Walker and had access to a policy team. But also as a result of the intersectional stigma measurement working group and having the opportunity to work with Tamara, she and I had just recently worked on two papers together that came out of that working group. And I realized that, you know, this next grant would be the perfect opportunity to collaborate with her. So another just coincidence of coming to GW and being at GW as the result of the intersectional working group, which was the result of the PRISM grant, which was the result of other random things that happened previously in my past. I had the opportunity to write this grant with Tamara, and it has been an amazing experience. Also a huge shout out to Allie, who is pictured on the slide. Allie came to us as a project director on the original Unite cohort and has stayed with me all this time. They moved from New York with me to Whitman Walker and are the Whitman Walker site PI for the Uplift cohort. And a huge shout out and thanks to Carlos, who has been an amazing collaborator across both of those cohorts. Both of them have enrolled in Spanish, and Carlos and his team have led the work to make sure that both of those studies were fully culturally tailored for Spanish-speaking folks in the United States. And then just to hit it home in terms of just the way that random chance can manifest in people's careers, that same summer after I had just started at Whitman Walker, so I accepted the job at Whitman Walker in December, at Whitman Walker NGW in December of 2020, and I started 2 days a week at Whitman Walker in January, and then I began my full-time position at GW and Whitman Walker in July of 2021. In that same month, NIH released this RFA for the build out of HIV-related biomedical research facilities for research with humans. And this was in particular focused on work with institutions that had a historical mission to serve underrepresented communities. And one interesting thing was that Whitman Walker was focused on building out this brand new facility in Southeast DC. And Whitman Walker was not eligible for this award because it did not grant doctoral degrees. And GW was not eligible for this award because they bring in too much grant money. But it became the perfect opportunity to form a partnership with my new role at both Whitman Walker and GW to bring Whitman Walker and GW together to mutually make one another eligible for this award. So NIH had never released a biomedical research facilities for HIV research with humans. They've done a lot of these for non-human primates, but they've never done one for humans before. And it came out at just the perfect time when I was starting this new position and there was a lot of momentum to gear up for the new facility in Southeast DC, and a huge thanks to Alan for all of the many hours of meetings that he spent in with me, thinking about how to make this space the best that it could be, as well as Manya and the support from the dean. We had meetings with more than 12 GW faculty to find out what folks needed in space, what they were missing from the space that they currently had. And we put together this grant proposal, which was awarded last year. And we are just a few months away from filing the permits to begin the construction on this new biomedical research facility that will be jointly available for HIV research being conducted by folks at both Whitman Walker and GW. So I just thought that this was like the culmination of the experiences of fate that brought me to where I am today. And I will just end with a picture of a bunch of our team at Whitman Walker last summer at our staff outing. And I also would be remiss not to thank the many thousands of participants who have volunteered their time and shared their stories with me across multiple different studies. I've mentioned just a small number of mentors, collaborators, staff, students, and interns, and pictured a couple more in these slides, but I have missed countless numbers. My career has been fortunate to be touched by a lot of people that I did not have time to include in this brief presentation. My studies have benefited from the DC CFAR, the Fordham Ready, and the Weill Cornell CTSC. And then of course, a huge thanks to the National Institute of Health, and just a plug for people to develop relationships with project officers there. They are all incredibly happy to talk to folks who are interested in applying for awards. And I would not have gotten several of the grants that I got without having run by my initial ideas through project officers first and getting their feedback, which has proved incredibly valuable. So I always recommend that folks reach out to project officers early and often in the process of working on new grants. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you very much, John, for extremely entertaining and informative talk. So the talk is open now for questions. If any in the audience have questions to John, please raise your hands or unmute. I see Alan is ready to ask a question. Alan, please.
John, thank you very much. You know, Michael, I think, was brilliant for putting together this seminar series, because it allows us, in a sense, to peek behind, and people are very open about sharing how they got to be who they are today. And in my mind, you're a paradigm of being able to share that. And it was fascinating. I always wondered myself, how does he do it? And what you laid out was that you had scientific pillars, if you will, that you built based on your interests and mentorship and experiences and publications. And you established very formal things, areas of expertise, and sort of going this way. And then going this way, you looked for RFAs and opportunities and collaborators and project officers who could sort of marry the pillars of your science with opportunities that develop for furthering your research through grant opportunities. It's quite brilliant. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Am I on the right track? We have a lot of junior investigators on the phone who are trying to see how this applies to them. And if you could just comment a little on the methods behind your own career growth, and if I'm on the right or wrong page, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Alan. I think, yes, I think what you're saying is right. I think maybe you're giving me too much credit. One of the things I wanted to highlight was like the ways in which I leaned into opportunities that were presented to me, but I didn't necessarily always create those opportunities. It was the result of a combination of hard work and luck. But yeah, I think one of the things that I always recommend for earlier career folks is to actually pay attention to the concept clearances that different institutes and centers put out. So every NIH institute and center has a council, and the council meets 3 times a year. And during those council meetings, the ideas that are going to become future RFAs are presented by NIH staff to their council for approval. And you can either just go to you can Google council and then like the name of the institute like NIDA or NIMH and go and just look at the minutes, or you can actually go to the NIH videocast and watch the session when the staff member presented that, and you'll also hear the feedback that the council gave to the staff member, which I think is particularly helpful and interesting. And I think the biggest piece of advice that I have is to do that, because it allows you at least 6 months of extra time to start planning for that grant, because they pretty much always get approved, and they almost always become RFAs. And so by the time an RFA is released, the turnaround time is incredibly short. Most RFAs are due within 2 to 3 months of their release, which is a very short amount of time to write a grant, depending on how complex the proposal is. But if you watch the council meetings or you check the council minutes, you will actually be able to see what's coming as an RFA at least 6 months ahead of time, which is really great and gives you time not only to develop your ideas and your team, but also possibly to collect pilot data, or at least to repurpose data that you might be able to get access to as pilot data for that award. So I still do that. I go and look at the concept clearances for about 5 different ICs every quarter when they're released, just to see what's coming. And I try to share those with people who I think they'll be of interest to, so that there is that sense of advanced warning. It's one of the, I've had a lot more success with RFAs than I've had with the general submissions during the normal cycles. And so I try to help people find those RFA opportunities, because I think the success rate for a lot of RFAs tends to be higher because the money is already set aside. People don't have enough time to pull together their ideas. So I think that has been something that I try to share with other people, is to go and look for those concept clearances in advance to start formulating your ideas, so that you have that extra time, because they're going to fund a select number of applications no matter what. The money is there, and if you can be in the top however many, 4 or 5 applications, then that funding comes incredibly quickly relative to the normal cycle, where you typically have to submit, wait 5 months, get your feedback. Oftentimes you have to resubmit. So
Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious later on, I don't want to dominate the Q&A, but if that same strategy could be applied to basic science as well.
yeah, it applies to all of the NIH institutes and centers. So they have concept clearances. Like, so NIAID has, each of their divisions has concept clearances every cycle.
John, let me ask you a question, since I don't see other people raising hands. This CO6 center that you mentioned, what is actually the kind of, it will be new building, right? Or it will be a new kind of new construction? So I just wonder, what is expected, or what research is expected to be done in this building?
Yeah, so the building is, it is a new building, but the building is not funded by the grant. The building, so it's Whitman Walker's new flagship building in Southeast DC in Ward 8. And we had a floor in that building that was not designated for Whitman Walker, that was going to be subleased out to another tenant. And what happened was they let me take half of that floor to write the grant with. So instead of subleasing it out to another tenant, they gave me access to half of that floor. So this grant funds the construction of the facility on that floor. So it's about 10,000 square feet of space. It has a BSL-2 plus lab and a USP 797 sterile compounding facility for pharmaceuticals. And it has 3 procedure rooms and 5 exam rooms and a couple of consult rooms, plus a bunch of offices and staff spaces. So it's really designed to be a collaborative research environment for basic and translational and clinical HIV research. And we partnered as Whitman Walker NGW for the submission, but the goal is that hopefully someday we'll be able to open it up, for use by other DCC FAR institutions as well. We still have to construct the space and then come up with the steering committee that will oversee the use of the space and start figuring out some of those details. And then the goal would be that it would be able to serve the DCC FAR ultimately. So it would be a human research. It's dedicated for HIV focused research and well suited for clinical, basic, and translational HIV research. We do have a floor above that that is not funded by the grant, that is funded by Whitman Walker, that is also focused on community oriented social and behavioral science and public health research. But the grant funded space is specifically really honing in on translational, clinical, and basic science.
Thank you.
And Jonathan, just to follow up on that, the process by which investigators will be able to interact with the clinical space once it's operational?
We have not 100% figured that out yet. There will be a steering committee and likely some kind of application process. The space doesn't open for about a year. So we're hoping to have those details worked out in, say, the next 9 months so that we can start making those details available to people. But in the meantime, we have a facilities and resources document that describes the space if people are submitting grants that I'm happy to share with anyone who is submitting a grant so that they could include a description of the space as a potential research facility in their grants.
If there are no questions, Michael, I'll just ask one more because I'm so interested in all this. The community aspects of this, Jonathan, Whitman Walker's obviously has a historic commitment to the DC community. You're moving into Ward 8. Could you talk a little bit more about the interface of putting down a brand new clinic and research facility in Ward 7 and 8 and how you intend to engage the community in the research process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of this was already being thought about before I came along and is bigger than the research. Folks have been at Whitman Walker have been heavily engaged in a couple of different groups, including the Ward 8 Health Council, that they attend regularly. But in terms of the research space, we are actually starting up a new community engagement group that we're going to start recruiting for over the next few weeks that is going to be institute-wide and focused on our research, policy, and education portfolio, really with a lot of amazing input based off of the CFAR's CPC. And in addition to that, we just hired a new manager of research outreach and engagement, Chanton, who is amazing and is really doing a lot of work going out into community to engage folks in understanding needs and priorities, as well as how to engage partners in the research process. And then fingers crossed, we did have some of our research scientists at Whitman Walker submit a CFAR supplement to do a community engagement process focused specifically on developing an HIV research agenda for work to be conducted in the new facility that would focus on a couple of key priority populations in Ward 7 and 8. So it focuses on trans people of color, youth, LGBTQ youth and adolescents, substance users, and cisgender Black women. And it would be a series of listening session, qualitative interviews, needs assessment, and then town hall listening sessions with folks from those groups living in Ward 7 and 8 to develop a community-centered agenda for the work that we will try to promote within the new NIH-funded research facility.
Thanks so much.
John, thank you very much for this presentation. I really did enjoy it. And, you know, you perked my interest when you started talking about Ward 7 and 8 and the CPC. And so I look forward to working with you on that. And a great opportunity is the next CPC meeting is going to be at Whitman Walker. And Lorena and I will be emailing you, asking you for a presentation to the CPC. So this would be a great opportunity for you to be there for that.
Yes, we look forward to having you at 1525, and we will have an even more amazing space for you come August or September to host one of your next meetings in Ward 8. Thank you, George.
Okay, if there is no more questions, or if there are questions and you just are shy to ask them, please email to John. I'm confident John will be happy to answer questions by email as well. But I thank everybody for today's participation. I think we had a very entertaining and very helpful talk, and I hope that all our junior investigators who didn't have ability to present today will access the recording of this talk at the Developmental Core website. We have recordings of all the Path to Independence talks. So thank you very much for today's participation, and I hope to see you at our next meeting.
Thank you, John. That was great.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.